The Cubs are back in the postseason, not with the 100-win team that won the World Series title a year ago, but still a talented roster that's actually very similar when you look at it. We welcome in MLBpipeline.com's Jim Callis. And Jim, I think most people would say, oh, the Cubs drafted great. All these players came up through the system. While that's not necessarily true, they certainly have some key homegrown talent.
They do. I mean, I thought, as they were rebuilding, I thought the Cubs had the best collection of position prospects I've seen in 25 years of covering this stuff. You look at their roster, and they're only going to have 6 truly homegrown players on it, which is as few as any of the playoff teams in baseball. But what's interesting is they have a run of 5 straight first-round picks, all playing key roles on the team. Started with Javier Baez, who was drafted by the previous administration, then followed up with Albert Almora, Chris Bryant, Kyle Schwarber, and Ian Happ. So, I mean, that's a pretty good core. And they don't get credit, but Addison Russell, while he wasn't purely homegrown because he was drafted by the A's and came over to the Jeff Samardzija trade, Addison Russell really did a lot of his developing in the Cubs system. And the same thing with Anthony Rizzo, who was originally drafted by Theo Epstein and Company in Boston, was still a prospect when they acquired him. So those guys aren't quite homegrown, but they still feel homegrown. And internationally, the big one is Wilson Contreras, who's really solidified the catching position for the Chicago.
When you look at the closer role for this Cubs team, they made a trade a year ago to get Aroldis Chapman. This year it was another trade to bring in their closer, but before the season started.
Right, and they didn't have to give up Gleyber Torres. They gave up Jorge Soler, who was one of that he was part of that big position player crop, and basically ran out of room to play all these guys in Chicago. They traded him for Wade Davis, who's had a tremendous year for the Cubs, really nailed down the end of the bullpen. Obviously, when they were going through the rebuilding process, they benefited from a number of nice trades. At the trade deadline in 2012, they got Kyle Hendricks, who was largely unknown at the time. They got him in a deal for Ryan Dempster. The next year, they got Jake Arrieta, also Pedro Strop, in a deal for Scott Feldman and Steve Clevenger. And the Cubs will admit that they didn't realize those guys were as good as they've become, but they've really helped out the team. 2014, like I mentioned, they got Addison Russell. One of the first moves that Theo Epstein and Company made was to trade Andrew Kashner to get Anthony Rizzo. So they've really made a lot of trades. As you mentioned with Wade Davis, last couple of years, as they've gone from rebuilding to contending and going after a championship, they've started trading prospects to get players. You mentioned Wade Davis. They also made a big trade in July to get Jose Quintana to shore up their rotation. They gave up Eloy Jimenez, who's one of the very best prospects in baseball, an outfielder. Again, they would have trouble finding places for everybody to play in their lineup. They could really use the DH. And they also gave up Dylan Cease as part of that package, hard-throwing right-hander. And then they kind of did some fine-tuning right at the deadline where they picked up Alex Avila to back up Contreras, catcher, and Justin Wilson to give him another lefty in the bullpen. Gave up 2 more interesting prospects, in Jaime Candelario and Isaac Paredes.
They've added some big free agents as well. Some have worked out better than others, but John Lester kind of started the winning turnaround there in Chicago.
They did. I mean, that was kind of a message that, okay, we've been rebuilding, and now we're going to try to win. And he helped them win in 2015, get to the playoffs, and then obviously win it all in 2016. He's been a little banged up down the stretch, but if they're going to win another World Series, he'll obviously have to play a key role. They spent big money on him. They spent big money on Jason Hayward, who hasn't quite worked out, I don't think, like they anticipated. They spent, a decent amount of money on Ben Zobrist, who obviously helped them win the World Series. This offseason was more kind of fine-tuning. They had 3 free agent signings in the offseason. Koji Uehara, who pitched well for him but is hurt and probably won't be on the postseason roster. But Brian Densing has been the lefty they were hoping to get to play that role in the bullpen. He's had a very nice year. And John Jay has done what John Jay does, which is hit line drives and play solid defense, and a versatile outfielder added to their outfield depth. So the big-ticket guys haven't necessarily come through this year as hoped, but their lesser free agents have done a nice job for them.